people want to start speaking because some people want to do the precocious 12-year-old who's running to the front is. Some of you probably think of walked off the set of Home Alone 1 or something, but I've taken the evening off the paper round to speak to you tonight. It's an honour to be on this platform because, for a very poor reason, the voices we've just heard of people speaking from experience, because ever since this government has come to power, those voices have been airbrushed out of existence, ignored, and of course demonised. And one of the most important things the People's Assembly can do is give a platform to people, to be able to give people the ability to speak from experience, to tell people about what they're going through as a result of the outrageous policies of this unelected government. I also want to say this: I've got a very bad reputation amongst one of my old housemate who grew up in the Rhondda of milking, however tenuously, a local connection. But nonetheless, I'm going to do it. As my name suggests, my dad is very proud of his Welsh heritage. They can't remember whether they named me after Owen Jones or Robert Owen. I'm going to ruin that goodwill by pointing out he's North Walian. But nonetheless, very proud to be in this country again. For this reason, there's a very proud history in this town, in this county, and in this nation of people organising together against injustice and of standing against power. Whether it be the fact that this was one of the heartlands, of course, of the Industrial Revolution, and with it, the labour movement itself. Whether you think, of course, of the Chartists, the Welsh Chartists, it was here, of course, in this town, William Price was one of the great leaders of the Chartists. Whether it be just down the road in Pontypridd, the infamous or famous Pontypridd riots, when working people, miners, took to the streets and fought against the police and army who were sent to crush them on behalf of the mining companies. Whether it be the thousands who took part in the general strike. My granddad was one of them. His wages got docked as a result, and I still intend to get revenge for that at some point. Whether it be, of course, those who fought passionately and courageously against Thatcherism as it hammered strong and proud communities. These are our traditions. These are traditions of people organising from below, of standing up for their rights. And those are the traditions this People's Assembly stands in. I just want to make this clear. It's so important to make this clear. This isn't a talking shop. This isn't us just getting things off our chest. It's not a therapy session. The point of it is to build a grassroots movement. Whether it be, I don't know, St Albans to Glasgow, Manchester to Cardiff, Leeds to Bangor. I got invited to speak at People's Assembly in Finland. I've never even heard of Finland. And that's the point. Right across this country now, there are dozens of groups, 90 groups, 90 towns and cities, where people like you are meeting like this. And the reason it's so important is this: the biggest party in the country isn't Labour or the Tories, or certainly not the Lib Dems. It's the people yelling at the TV every time George Osborne appears party. And we've all made a conscious decision tonight. We've all made a conscious decision tonight. We're not just going to keep yelling at the TV. We will do that because it is quite therapeutic. But we're going to actually come out and organise and fight back. I'm going to surprise some of you. I'm actually going to hand it to the Tories. You're going to stand back in awe of what they've done. Because they turned a crisis of the market and they turned it into a crisis of public spending. They managed to get away with this idea. The reason we're in this mess is because of overspending, not just a myth that they themselves backed Labour spending plans pound for pound until the end of 2008 itself. They've used this crisis to push policies they've always wanted to get away with, but knew they otherwise couldn't without using a crisis. And then they claim victory, just as even on their own terms they failed. They said they were going to wipe the deficit out over the course of this Parliament. The underlying deficit is growing. Debt is piling, of course, day by day, week by week, month by month. And they've sucked growth out of the economy to the extent that this is the longest economic crisis, not since the 80s, not since the 70s, friends, not since even the Great Depression. This is the longest economic crisis in modern British history. And the reality is this: there's as much sign of recovery in people's lives as there is a sense of shame in the statements of the Conservative Party. Because as things stand,
We're going through the longest fall in living standards since Queen Victoria sat on the throne of this country. For the first time since bombs stopped falling on continental Europe in World War II, the next generation is set to be poorer than the last. Since this government came to power, since the infamous Clegg Cameron Lovin in the Rose Garden, the average person is £1,500 a year poorer than they were back in 2010. It's not to say it's not booming for some people, it certainly is. Like Wonga, they managed to celebrate a 36% increase in their profits. There's a good reason for that. There are rich pickings for vultures in austerity Britain. Every single month, 1 million families in this country depend on legal loan sharks to pay for food, for rent, for mortgages, to have clothes for their kids, to pay off other forms of debt. And then there's another booming industry, food banks. 500,000 people now depend on food banks. We have charities talking of parents having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their kids. We've got the size of school lunch portions shrinking because of budget cuts. This is the 7th richest country on the face of the earth. And apparently we can no longer afford to feed our poorest children. That is the shame, the reality of austerity Britain. And it goes further than that. We have now an army of zero-hour contract workers, hundreds of thousands of workers. It's a return to the Victorian era, when you had dockers who had to march to the yard in the morning and stick their hands up to actually have to ask for work that day. Many of them, of course, had to go off home. We have people working all hours, slugging their guts out for wages that just don't allow them to make ends meet. And again, since 2010, the number of people working for below the living wage has gone from 3.4 million to 4.8. A quarter of women now who are in work now slog their guts out for less than a wage that allows them to live. Again, this is the recovery this government is talking about. As we've heard so eloquently, we have hundreds of thousands of households being punished collectively for the failure of successive governments to build council housing, with one of the most unjust policies inflicted by a government in modern times, the bedroom tax. We have disabled people being humiliated, degraded, forced through the national travesty that is ATOS, support stripped away from them, forcing them into misery and despair. We have 5 million people now languishing on social housing waiting lists, millions of families forced into the private landlord sector with its extortionate rents and insecure tenancies. We have our NHS, our National Health Service, being sold off to the vultures circling above. Even now our Royal Mail, in defiance of the overwhelming majority of people in this country, friends, including Conservative voters. Friends, with such injustice, with such attack, one day all of us will be asked what we did to fight back. We will be asked, what did you do when people were going through the biggest squeeze in living standards since the 1870s? What were you doing when people were having to choose between heating their homes and feeding their kids? When people didn't have secure work? When people couldn't afford to make ends meet in one of the richest countries that ever was? And that's what we're here to answer. We're here to be able to say that we did actually do something to fight back. And the shame of this government, this is what they do. They've demonised and attacked the poorest people in society. We have the sight of them legislating against people struggling to make ends meet. MPs who a few years ago were fiddling expenses to pay for moats and second homes. And what they've done, this is one of the most cynical things this government has done. They try to redirect people's justifiable anger at their ever-falling living standards, from the people at the top who caused this crisis to people's neighbours down the streets, the working poor against the unemployed, non-disabled people against disabled people, private sector workers against public sector workers, those living here against immigrants. If you're a low-paid worker, your wage is being slashed by your boss. Your tax credits are being slashed by the Tories. Who do they want you to turn on? The scrounger down the road. If you're someone, a call centre worker, a supermarket worker, who has no pension, with pensions decimated in the private sector, who do they want you to resent? The nurse next door whose pension is still intact. And this is where divide and rule ends. This is where it's ended up in. So it ended up in the sight of vans paid for by public money into mixed communities, spray painted with the sorts of slogans that belong on national front posters in the 1980s. The state. So why shouldn't your less deserving neighbour be mugged as well? A cynical attempt to turn large sections of its own people against each other. But that's where we come in. Because all of you will know often better than myself, there's no shortage of anger out there. There's no shortage of fear. But there's one thing missing, and that's hope. And it was Harvey Milk, the crusading civil rights campaigner in the 1970s, he said this: I know you cannot live on hope alone, but without it life is not worth living. And the point is, it doesn't matter how angry people get, it doesn't matter how scared they get. If they don't have hope, they don't fight back. They might yell at the TV, their anger might be turned at their neighbour, but they won't have the confidence to fight back. And that's where we come in. We've got to give people hope. And we do that by offering a coherent alternative that actually resonates with people. I just want to talk a few ideas, and I hammer about these down to death. Some of you will have heard it all before, and the fact is our enemies hammer their messages time and time again. They drill them into people's skulls, and we've got to do the same. So they say to us, spending on social security is too high. Might surprise some of you, they've got a point. It's not to do with a bunch of lazy scroungers dribbling on sofas all day in mansions made out of widescreen television sets as they churn empty kids out every week. It's because of this. We've got a triple crisis. We've got a housing crisis, a low wages crisis, and a jobs crisis. People have absolutely every right to be furious about the £24 billion of housing benefit being wasted each year. It's not lining the pockets of the tenants. It's lining the pockets of private landlords charging extortionate rents. The successive government as well as controlling rent, give councils the power to build housing, creating jobs. The same with tax credits. Tax credits are a lifeline for millions, but let's be honest. They're a subsidy for low pay because bosses aren't paying their workers properly. So we should demand no ifs and no buts, a living wage. And with a living wage, we'll spend less on tax credits and other in-work benefits. And when you put money in the pockets of the poorest, they don't shove it in a bank account in the Cayman Islands like the people at the top do. They go out and spend it. And of course, the jobs crisis. 6.5 million people now looking for full-time work that just doesn't exist. The other week in all, over 600 people applied for just one job as an administrator. That is the reality of desperation out there that is ignored. So we must call for an industrial strategy to create hundreds of thousands of renewable energy jobs, as Germany have done, to take on the environmental and the jobs crisis. Let's talk about the banks. The reality is we nationalise the debt and privatise the profit. We, the people who bailed those banks out, have no control over them. So we must demand that we, the people who bailed them out, have democratic control of our banks, a public investment bank to rebuild our shattered economy. Let's talk about tax justice. We hear about benefit fraud every single day. It does exist. Less than 1% of total social security spending, 1.2 billion a year. Compare that to £25 billion every single year because the people at the top aren't paying their taxes. Amazon, Google, Sir Philip Green. So we must demand, again, no ifs, no buts, to change the law so it says clearly, unambiguously, whoever you are, you will pay your taxes. And friends, we've got to be more radical than that. We've got to talk about, for example, childcare. The fact the average family now spends a third of their average income on their kids. In Sweden, it's capped, it's 3%. They have an excellent state-run childcare system. It pays for itself because people can go out and work. Let's talk about the fact we have extortionate railway ticket prices because we now spend as a country, as taxpayers, 4 times more on our privatised fragmented service. So again, let's demand, as each franchise expires, bring them into public ownership with passengers elected onto board. bad rep for basically being a bit people's front of Judea. I suspect maybe a smirking or bitterness than anything else. The point is, we can afford then to quibble over minor details, but too much is at stake now. And the point of this is to bring together as broad a front as possible, so millions of public sector and private sector workers, whether you're in the Labour Party, Plaid, the Green Party or no party at all, campaigners for disabled people, young people, elderly people, people fighting for tax justice, as broad a coalition as possible. And of course we'll disagree. Of course there'll be dissent. Of course we'll argue over this or that. Good. Every democratic movement, that should be the lifeblood. But at the end of the day, what we've got to decide is this. Even when we disagree over this detail or that priority, we're on the same side. And that's what we must remember as we build this movement. And the most important things coming up, of course, are the Tories having the cheek to invade my home city, Manchester. They'll get a very warm Mancunian welcome. I hope as many people as possible can make it. On the 5th of November, there's going to be a day of national civil disobedience and protest, and I hope activities are organised here as part of that. Because I just want to end by saying this. This is why it's so important what we're doing, as well as giving people hope. The reality is, everything we have, all the rights, all the gains, they weren't given to us by the goodwill and generosity of those above. They were won by the struggle and sacrifice of those below. Our mothers and our fathers, our grandfathers and our grandmothers. They built this country. They built the welfare state, the NHS, workers' rights, everything previous generations took for granted. It is not for us to allow that to be stripped away. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And that is why we must stand in that tradition, courageously, bravely, standing up for people's rights, if you like, but also standing for a different sort of country. Not just fighting austerity, but fighting for a society that is run in the interests of working people. It was Nye Bevan, of course, who said this: the NHS will last as long as there are folk left with a faith to fight for it. It doesn't just apply to the NHS, it applies to so much else. We have that faith, we have that fight, and if we stand together, we fight together, we will win this together. Thank you.
No,